Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Satan, we're gonna tear your kingdom down. Yes, we are. Oh, Satan, Satan, we're gonna bring it down. Oh, yes, you in the kingdom, yes. All over the land, you know what, Satan, your kingdom is coming down, it's coming down.
Educational video and the fair use doctrine. We want to clarify that this video is intended solely for educational purposes. The content is a transformative work that incorporates copyrighted material while strictly adhering to the fair use doctrine. The objective is to provide a narrative that encourages critical thinking and motivates viewers to form their own opinions. All copyrighted material belongs to its respective owners, and there is no intention of violating any copyright laws. Additionally, this video is protected under the Fair Use Doctrine. Wise Society is a virtual platform that aims to instill wisdom and knowledge into education. It is powered by Bold Enterprises, LLC, and can be found on YouTube under the handle The Bold Authority.
These people, the Citizens Council people who were doing a lot of the dirty work, they were supported by state groups in some cases. You know that sovereignty commission they had down in Mississippi? They gave money to those folks. And you know, you always felt that you were on guard down there. You didn't know how much to say to anybody that you might be interviewing, because you didn't know what the connection was to Citizens Council or somebody else who was protesting. And you just pretty much had to play it by ear.
And the White Citizens Council now, they were really strong because they were part of the establishment. I mean, you had people who were ministers, who were business people, who were journalists, who were members of the White Citizens Council. They were sort of the uptown clan, you know, the white collar clan. And they kept things really tight. I mean, at that time, the criminal justice system in the Deep South was really so all white and so oppressive that it's almost hard to believe when you look back at it today. That is, if you saw a black in those days at the courthouse, the black was either a defendant or was pushing a broom. Otherwise, you didn't see blacks. You had all white juries. You had white judges, white prosecutors, white attorneys. Everything was white. Everywhere you had in this country a large black population, you had racial discrimination. There's no question about that. It was just that in the South you had the Jim Crow laws, where by law you had segregation and white supremacy.
Shadows of Supremacy, unveiling the White Citizens Council's role in America's racial divide. The word system comes from the late Latin word systema, which in turn is derived from the Greek systema, meaning organized whole, a whole compounded of parts. The Greek word comes from syn, meaning together, and histenai, meaning to set, to cause, to stand. This term came into English use in the early 17th century. The etymology reflects the idea of a collection of elements that are connected to form a whole, with an implication that the parts work interdependently. This concept can be applied broadly, ranging from biological systems, like the nervous system in the human body, to mechanical systems, like the braking system in a car, to social systems, like the education system within a society. Systemic relates directly to systems in the sense that it refers to something that is deeply ingrained in or affects the entirety of, a system. It comes from the word system with the suffix "ic," which indicates pertaining to or of the nature of. Systemic issues are those that are not just surface-level problems, but are built into the underlying structure of the system itself. This term is often used in contexts such as systemic change, which implies change at a fundamental system-wide level, or systemic disease, which suggests a condition that affects the whole body.
Words of a martyred president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
There will always be dissident voices heard in the land, expressing opposition without alternatives, finding fault but never favor, perceiving gloom on every side, and seeking influence without responsibility. Those voices are inevitable. But today, other voices are heard in the land. Voices preaching doctrines wholly unrelated to reality. Doctrines which apparently assume that words will suffice without weapons, that vituperation is as good as victory, and that peace is a sign of weakness. We cannot expect that everyone will talk sense to the American people, but we can hope that fewer people will listen to nonsense, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men.
Words of a martyred president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Words of warning against extremism and hate, taken from a speech he was to deliver in Dallas, Texas. Words he never uttered. Before he could, an assassin's bullet took his life. One fact is clear. Whatever pushed the mind of the assassin, hate pulled the trigger. And hatred, blind, bitter, savage hatred, the very hatred against which John F. Kennedy warned, blights the land. It surges forth from the distant fringes of our society, from the extreme right and from the extreme left, and it poisons the atmosphere of our political life. Hatred, in any form and from any source, is cancerous, and hatred is the stock in trade of the extremists.
The system of white supremacy refers to a socio-political system that historically and presently, in many places, privileges white people over those of other racial backgrounds. It's a systemic issue because this set of beliefs and practices is embedded within the structure of society, permeating its institutions and policies, thereby affecting economic, political, and social dynamics. The system of white supremacy operates by maintaining social, economic, and political inequalities that give preferential treatment to people identified as white. It is reinforced through institutional policies, cultural norms, and social practices that collectively work to uphold racial hierarchies. This can manifest through various forms of discrimination, domination, control, exploitation, exclusion, intimidation, rage, and violence. To understand white supremacy is to recognize that it is not just an attitude or set of beliefs held by individual people. Rather, it is deeply embedded within the structures and institutions of society, making it systemic and widespread. Addressing it requires shift and overhaul, which involves doing away with the underlying structures, policies, and practices that allow it to persist. Embark with us on a revealing journey through America's past as we delve into the shadowy realms of the white citizens' councils. With a critical eye, we'll uncover the pivotal role and function these councils played in the intricate tapestry of white supremacy. Understand the mechanisms of how such organizations cemented racial divides, and engage with a piece of history that continues to shape the conversations and practices regarding race and power dynamics.
This is hate, A handbill passed out on the streets of Dallas, November 22, 1963, the day President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And this is hate. A full-page advertisement carried in the Dallas Morning News the same day. Why have you ordered your brother Bobby, the Attorney General, to go soft on communists? This, too, is hate. The Honorable Adlai Stevenson, American ambassador to the United Nations, hemmed in by hooting right-wing extremists. Violence erupts. And this, Dallas, 1960. Vice presidential candidate Lyndon B. Johnson and his wife harassed by extremists. But Dallas is not unique. Hate is epidemic. New York City. The Honorable Earl Warren, Chief Justice of the United States, is picketed. Members of a front group for the extremist John Birch Society hurled placards, leaflets, and insults at him. And Birmingham. 4 Negro children are killed in church by a bomb whose fuse was racial hatred. Extremism, hate. One breeds the other. And the far right and far left find a common camping ground in their extremism, their violence and lawlessness, and their contempt for democracy. Incidents like the attack on Stevenson, on Warren, on Johnson, don't just happen. Thousands of bumper stickers, publications, radio programs, years of frenzied agitation by extremist demagogues smearing the United Nations finally exploded into the attack on Stevenson. And hundreds of thousands of leaflets, billboards, and steady drumfire of slander and defamation, accusations that he and the Supreme Court favor communists, even charges that he and other justices are communists, led inevitably to the assault on Chief Justice Warren. Hatred, naked hatred in these incidents, separated by hundreds of miles, but united by common roots in right-wing extremist groups. Well organized, growing, richly financed, stretching from Dallas to New York, from Seattle to St. Petersburg, from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon, menacing the security of the trade union movement, subverting civil rights and civil liberties, threatening democracy. Today, right-wing groups number more than 3,000, claim more than 4 million members, and millions of unaffiliated fellow travelers. The right wing has manpower. Money, too. Lavish donations from big business amounting to more than $10 million annually, from thousands of individuals who think they have found a cause. Profits from the sale of publications to zealous followers. All these pour an estimated $25 million a year into extremist treasuries. Let's examine some of these extremist groups, find out what they say, what they stand for, why they are a deadly threat to progress and to our free institutions. Start with the John Birch Society. More than 100,000 strong, bigger than many international unions. Income, $750,000 a year. Membership militant, dedicated, growing, secret. Its leader, this man, Robert Welch. He calls former President Eisenhower a conscious, dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy. Says, democracy is a perennial fraud. Arouses his followers with statements like this. As of July 1st, 1960, our experts place the total communist influence over our national activities at a minimum of 40% of total control. In the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, Welch draws a sinister blueprint for action, commands Birchers to conceal themselves behind hundreds of fronts, to grab control of parent-teachers associations and other civic groups, to intimidate and purge liberal educators and school board members, to gag liberal clergymen. In the name of anti-communism, Welch orders Birchers to take a leaf out of the book of the American Communist Party to use communist tactics, infiltrating influence groups, then taking them over. In practice, the John Birch brand of Americanism divides communities, sets neighbor against neighbor, creates discord and suspicion. It even makes spies of school children. This episode, as reported in Life magazine, portrays a high school student, son of a John Birch Society member. At his father's instructions, he concealed a tape recorder inside a dummy textbook. He tried to trap his teacher into saying something the John Birch Society yardstick would measure as subversive. The aim, to get the teacher fired. The reason? She spoke favorably of the United Nations, assigned reading from liberal as well as conservative journals. This type of local fallout strikes countless American communities as a result of the explosion of hate and fear set off by the John Birch Society and other hate groups. Another key right-wing group, Americans for Constitutional Action. Two of its top 3 officers are also leaders in the John Birch Society. Politically aggressive, alert, effective. Its trained political workers swarm into the field in election years to help reactionary, anti-labor candidates for Congress. ACA distributes a voting index, awarding favorable ratings only to congressmen who oppose measures to improve Social Security, unemployment compensation, minimum wage, and all the other social welfare programs labor supports.
The White Citizens Councils, also known as the Citizens Councils of America, were organizations that emerged in the United States during the mid-20th century. These councils were primarily composed of white Americans who opposed racial integration and the civil rights movement. The purpose of the White Citizens Councils was to advocate for segregation and to maintain the social and political dominance of white citizens. They sought to preserve the racial hierarchy that existed at the time, particularly in the southern states. The councils used various tactics, such as economic pressure, intimidation, and propaganda to discourage African Americans and their supporters from challenging segregation laws. The White Citizens Councils were not a centralized organization with a single set of founding leaders. Instead, they were grassroots movements that emerged in various communities across the southern states of the United States. While there were influential individuals associated with the councils, it is important to note that many members operated at the local level, forming independent chapters. These chapters were led by local community leaders, business owners, and politicians who opposed racial integration and championed segregation. One notable figure associated with the White Citizens Councils was Robert B. Patterson, a Mississippi-based lawyer who helped establish the first council in that state in 1954. Other prominent council leaders include Thomas Pickens Brady, a businessman from Mississippi, and Jesse B. Stoner, a businessman from Georgia. White Citizens Council's ideas and actions were rooted in racism and discrimination. Some of the characteristics associated with the White Citizens Councils are: 1, white supremacy. The White Citizens Councils were rooted in white supremacist ideology, promoting the belief in the superiority of the white race and advocating for white dominance and segregation. 2, opposition to desegregation. Their primary objective was to resist racial desegregation efforts, particularly in the American South. They vehemently opposed the landmark Supreme Court case, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which mandated the desegregation of public schools. 3, segregationist policies. The councils worked to maintain racial segregation in all aspects of life, including schools, housing, employment, and public facilities. They used various tactics such as economic pressure, intimidation, and violence to enforce racial separation. 4. Economic coercion. The white citizens' councils employed economic coercion as a tool to maintain white supremacy. They boycotted businesses that supported integration or hired African Americans, effectively damaging their economic viability. 5. Political influence. The councils were politically active and sought to exert influence over local, state, and national politics. They supported politicians who shared their segregationist views and worked to block civil rights legislation. 6. Grassroots organizing. White citizens' councils had a strong grassroots presence in many communities, garnering support from white citizens who shared their beliefs. They held meetings, organized rallies, and disseminated propaganda to further their cause. 7. Use of fear and intimidation. The councils utilized fear tactics and intimidation to discourage African Americans and sympathetic white individuals from supporting desegregation and civil rights. This included threats, violence, and even acts of terrorism against those who challenged their agenda.
These are the ACA heroes and how they rate on the voting records. Senator John Tower, Republican of Texas, 100%. Senator Barry Goldwater, Republican of Arizona, 99%. Senator Carl Curtis, Republican of Nebraska, 92%. But the ACA is bipartisan. It has Democratic heroes, too. Senator Harry Byrd, Democrat of Virginia, 94%. Senator A. Willis Robertson, Democrat of Virginia, 85%. Senator Strom Thurmond, Democrat of South Carolina, 86%. A roster of reaction. Next, Billy James Hargis and his so-called Christian Crusade. Hargis says, "We are trying to take over both political parties." He attacks trade unions and union leaders, saying, "In the majority of union convention resolutions, we see the Communist Party line followed closely and support of all unconstitutional socialistic schemes." He tells his followers, "When in doubt how to vote in an election, you will probably be right 99 times out of 100 if you vote opposite of the way advised by union bosses." An oil billionaire from Texas, H.L. Hunt, estimated income $140,000 a day, heads Lifelines Foundation, still another major factor in the extremist movement. Lifelines propaganda, attacking the federal government, the public school system, labor, and other institutions, reaches into millions of American homes through publications and daily radio and television programs over 324 stations. The White Citizens Councils are another force battering at democracy's foundations, merchants of hate playing on racial fears and prejudices to peddle other extremist merchandise. What is this line of merchandise? What are the right-wing hate groups selling? Take one item, so-called right-to-work laws. Just as the destruction of free trade unions has marked the ascendancy of both fascist and communist dictatorships, so the destruction of free trade unions is a high priority goal of American extremists, and one route toward this goal is the open shop. Walking hand in hand with other extremist groups is the National Right to Work Committee. One of its founders, E.S. Dillard, is a high figure in the John Birch Society. Most of its leaders are intimately tied to other right-wing organizations. In Kansas, leadership of the state group which put over an open shop law in 1958 was almost identical with the statewide high command of the John Birch Society. In Wyoming, pressured by extremist leaders, the state legislature ran through a right-to-work law in less than 10 days without benefit of public hearings. Let's take a look at the rest of the program the hate groups are promoting. They say, impeach Earl Warren. The real purpose, not to impeach the Chief Justice, but to enfeeble the Supreme Court itself, to prevent the court from protecting the civil rights and civil liberties of our citizens, to block court action, giving city voters equality with rural citizens through fair apportionment of election districts. They say, repeal the federal income tax. What they really want is to kill the progressive features of the income tax, to soak the poor and relieve the rich. They say, clamp antitrust restrictions on trade unions, repeal the wage-protecting Walsh-Healy and Davis-Bacon Acts. What they really want is to smash unions, to turn back the clock to the good old days when the individual worker was completely at the mercy of his employer. They say, end federal farm programs. They say, get the government out of education, health, housing, and other progressive programs. They say, scuttle the Social Security program, wage and hour laws, unemployment compensation. The public schools, they cry, are breeding grounds for communism. Their program for education, censor textbooks, gag educators, stifle dissent, thought control. Remember him? They say, tear down the whole structure of social welfare Franklin D. Roosevelt helped to create. It adds up to a program to chain the federal government to the sidelines of American life and to throttle our democratic institutions. The extremists teach hate and distrust of the government and attack Washington as if it were a foreign power, an enemy to be defeated, rather than an instrument for the welfare of all of us. All this they demand in the name of anti-communism. They see internal communism as an immediate threat to take over the nation. John Birch Society leader Robert Welch claims, our danger remains almost entirely internal, from communist influences right in our midst and treason right in our government. Reminds you of that old poem. Last night I saw upon the stair a little man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. Oh, how I wish he'd go away. The extremists, too, see little men who are not there. Everywhere they look, they see communists in control, in the government, in the schools, in the clergy, in labor, in the mass media of communications. Yet J. Edgar Hoover, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, says, the cause of communism is well served by the hate-mongers, the lunatic fringe, and others who preach a doctrine of malice and intolerance toward their fellow man. These venomous fanatics, whether they are extremists of the left or right, are carriers of a highly infectious disease. They have brought forth the bombs and ignited the flames that have killed decent Americans and even innocent children. They are a national disgrace. We've described the domestic program of the hate groups. How do they feel about the rest of the world? They say, get the United States out of the United Nations and the United Nations out of the United States. They say, stop foreign aid. They say, drop negotiations with other nations. Some of them even say, drop the bomb. Before they do, however, let's see what the right wing is like. It can be compared to a large building, cellar, main floors, and finally the penthouse. Start with the cellar, the American Nazi Party, a familiar symbol of horror. The National States' Rights Party, smear sheets and cheap tabloids. They say, white people and Jews do not think along the same lines. The Jews are destroying the country. Or, it is proven the world over that black and yellow skins are signs of mental and spiritual inferiority. Takes you back a few years, doesn't it? Remember? The master race? Move up to the main section of the building now. Here we find slicker, more expensive-looking publications. American Opinion, magazine of the John Birch Society. Inside, a great lady, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, is slandered. Says writer Westbrook Pegler, that woman was as bad as her idolaters said she was good, as cruel as they said she was benign, as selfish as they said she was generous. There are others, many others. Leaflets and brochures, too. They flood the land by the millions. Tabloids, smear sheets, magazines, leaflets. But that's only the beginning. The extremists spew hate over the airwaves straight into the living rooms of America. This map shows some of the more than 500 communities where daily or weekly right-wing radio programs are carried. Mannion Forum, 313 stations. Lifelines, 324. Dan Smoot, 133. Billy James Hargis, 200. Reverend Carl McIntyre, 527. In all, more than 6,000 extremist broadcasts a week. Now, let's take the elevator to the penthouse. There's a little more sophistication and a little less hysteria. Up here, Human Events and National Review, two influential, widely circulated publications. They attempt a more dignified approach. But the welfare of working people bows to the property rights of business, and the federal government is still the enemy. And so this is the building that houses the extremists. They have neighbors. The neighbors are not hate peddlers, but they share a common goal: reactionary government. AMPAC, the American Medical Political Action Committee. Medical men steadfastly guarding the health and welfare of the American people. Or political medicine men, selfishly hoarding their status and privilege at the expense of the people. Their target is defeat of candidates and incumbents who support health care for the elderly under Social Security. In Wisconsin, they lined up with the John Birch Society to support an extreme right-winger opposing liberal Representative Bob Kastenmeier. In Wyoming, they helped reactionary Millward Simpson defeat liberal Senator John Hickey. Elsewhere, their support reads, "For reactionaries only." BIPAC, the Business Industry Political Action Committee, a newcomer launched by the National Association of Manufacturers. It too says, only reactionaries need apply. 5 of BIPAC's 13 directors have ties with extremist groups. These groups are all pointing their political efforts in the same direction, to the right. This year and in the years ahead, it will be trying to elect the most reactionary government in the history of our nation. They'll be working to send men to Congress who will vote no on programs to expand the economy and achieve full employment. No on health care for the elderly. No on minimum wage. No on unemployment insurance. No on civil rights. No on fair tax programs. No on public housing. No on improved Social Security. No on aid to education. They're wasting no time. The purge list of liberals is already compiled. Senator Quentin Burdick, North Dakota. Senator Vance Hartke, Indiana. Gore, Tennessee. Hart, Michigan. McCarthy, Minnesota. McGee, Wyoming. Moss, Utah. Muskie, Maine. Williams, New Jersey. Yarborough, Texas. These and other liberal senators and scores of progressive congressmen. In his first major address to the American people as their president, Lyndon B. Johnson said, "Let us put an end to the teaching and preaching of hate and evil and violence. Let us turn away from the fanatics of the far left and the far right, from the apostles of bitterness and bigotry, from those defiant of law and those who pour venom into our nation's bloodstream." This is labor's battle. Today, more than ever before, American labor, which has always been in the forefront of the struggle for social justice and against oppression, must stand firm against the forces committed to our destruction and the weakening of all free institutions. The hate-mongers have learned to use the political process to achieve their ends. And it is in the political arena that the struggle must be waged. The battle can be won, but it is everybody's job. If support of COPE programs was important in the past, it is imperative today. If successful register and vote campaigns were necessary in the past, they are indispensable today. If an alert, informed electorate was desirable in the past, it is a burning need today. Democracy and the survival of free trade unions are at stake. The price of victory is effort. The effort must be ours.
When you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party comes to mind? The Republicans or the Democrats? Most people would probably say the Democrats, but this answer is incorrect. Since its founding in 1829, the Democratic Party has fought against every major civil rights initiative and has a long history of discrimination. The Democratic Party defended slavery, started the Civil War, opposed Reconstruction, founded the Ku Klux Klan, imposed segregation, perpetrated lynchings, and fought against the Civil Rights Acts of the 1950s and 1960s. In contrast, the Republican Party was founded in 1854 as an anti-slavery party. Its mission was to stop the spread of slavery into the new Western territories with the aim of abolishing it entirely. This effort, however, was dealt a major blow by the Supreme Court in the 1857 case Dred Scott versus Sandford. The court ruled that slaves aren't citizens, they're property. The 7 justices who voted in favor of slavery, all Democrats. The 2 justices who dissented, both Republicans. The slavery question was, of course, ultimately resolved by a bloody civil war. The commander-in-chief during that war was the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, the man who freed the slaves. 6 days after the Confederate Army surrendered, John Wilkes Booth, a Democrat, assassinated President Lincoln. Lincoln's vice president, a Democrat named Andrew Johnson, assumed the presidency. But Johnson adamantly opposed Lincoln's plan to integrate the newly freed slaves into the South's economic and social order. Johnson and the Democratic Party were unified in their opposition to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks citizenship, and the 15th Amendment, which gave blacks the vote. All 3 passed only because of universal Republican support. During the era of Reconstruction, federal troops stationed in the South helped secure rights for the newly freed slaves. Hundreds of black men were elected to Southern state legislatures as Republicans, and 22 black Republicans served in the U.S. Congress by 1900. The Democrats did not elect a black man to Congress until 1935. But after Reconstruction ended, when the federal troops went home, Democrats roared back into power in the South. They quickly reestablished white supremacy across the region with measures like black codes, laws that restricted the ability of blacks to own property and run businesses, and they imposed poll taxes and literacy tests used to subvert black citizens' right to vote. And how was all of this enforced? By terror, much of it instigated by the Ku Klux Klan, founded by a Democrat, Nathan Bedford Forrest. As historian Eric Foner, himself a Democrat, notes, in effect, the Klan was a military force serving the interests of the Democratic Party. President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, shared many views with the Klan. He resegregated many federal agencies and even screened the first movie ever played at the White House, the racist film, The Birth of a Nation, originally entitled The Klansman. A few decades later, the only serious congressional opposition to the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 came from Democrats. 80% of Republicans in Congress supported the bill, less than 70% of Democrats did. Democratic senators filibustered the bill for 75 days until Republicans mustered the few extra votes needed to break the logjam. And when all of their efforts to enslave blacks, keep them enslaved, and then keep them from voting had failed, the Democrats came up with a new strategy. If black people are going to vote, they might as well vote for Democrats, as President Lyndon Johnson was purported to have said about the Civil Rights Act. I'll have them voting Democrat for 200 years. So now, the Democratic Party prospers on the votes of the very people it has spent much of its history oppressing. Democrats falsely claim that the Republican Party is the villain, when in reality, it's the failed policies of the Democratic Party that have kept blacks down. Massive government welfare has decimated the black family. Opposition to school choice has kept them trapped in failing schools. Politically correct policing has left black neighborhoods defenseless against violent crime. So when you think about racial equality and civil rights, which political party should come to mind? I'm Carol Swain, Professor of Political Science and Law at Vanderbilt University for Prager University.
One of the largest throngs ever to jam the state Coliseum gathered in Montgomery February 10th to hear the Supreme Court segregation decisions denounced in ringing tones and to join in shouting a Southern challenge to the integration decrees. Between 10 and 11,000 persons heard from those who have led in the fight against integration. The entire Montgomery City Commission was on the rostrum, Mayor W.A. Gale with Commissioners Clyde Sellers and Frank Parks. Georgia's Attorney General Eugene Cook was among the dignitaries, along with Robert Patterson, a founder of the White Citizen Council movement, and Mississippi Senator James Eastland. Cook then introduced Eastland as one of the few Southern senators who had dared defend the South's position on the floors of Congress. The Mississippi senator received an ovation from the crowd. Then, before returning to his prepared address, Eastland told the thousands he was sure that you and Alabama are not going to permit the NAACP to take over your schools. This was taken as a reference to the rioting on the University of Alabama campus in protest to the presence of Negro co-ed Arthurine Lucy. Again referring to the NAACP, Eastland said the organization would never be permitted to use your little children as pawns in the game of racial politics. The senator had high praise for the Alabama legislature's interposing of state authority over federal decree in education matters.
The legislature deserves the highest praise and commendation for its courageous action in being the first state to adopt a resolution of interposition or nullification. Whether it states the racial integrity, the culture, the creative genius, and the advanced civilization of the white race. The entire future of this country is at issue. You Alabamians have accepted the gauntlet and are fighting for these things, and in addition, you are protecting home and fireside. Yes, you have honored me by inviting me to address such a group as you on an occasion such as this. Names of you, ladies and gentlemen, here assembled, will have a very high place upon that roll of honor. In a time of grave trouble, you have reacted in keeping with the finest and highest traditions of the Southland. As long as your state and the South are blessed with people such as you, we have no fear of the future.
He called on the people to organize from the grassroots up and present a solid front against integration, with the battle to be fought on the state level. He said the state could use reasons other than color to segregate.
A state can adopt different policies. It can segregate on moral grounds. It can segregate under its police powers to protect the public health, to prevent violence, to promote peace. That is not segregation based on race. The state can adopt policies which local districts and counties cannot. The state can close down a school. The state can abolish a school district and create another one. And so I say that it is absolutely essential that each of the southern states adopt a state policy, a state program to preserve racial segregation.
The White Citizens Council left a lasting legacy in the United States through its staunch advocacy for white supremacist beliefs, its influence on local and regional politics, also by use of its power through religious organizations that still impact the rights and freedoms of black people. Based on the White Citizens Council members' agenda, practices, and behavior, we can identify who is carrying out their legacy. One of the key strategies of the White Citizens Council was its promotion of racist policies in opposition to desegregation efforts during the Civil Rights era. The organization played a significant role in organizing resistance to the Civil Rights Movement, where it sought to maintain black inferiority and white dominance. The Council's efforts to preserve Jim Crow laws, resist allowing blacks to have equal protection under the law, along with prohibiting equal access to resources, which all have left a lasting impact on the struggle for rights in the United States. Furthermore, the strategies and tactics employed by the White Citizens Council, such as economic coercion, social ostracism, and political pressure, influenced the broader landscape of white supremacist activism in the United States. While the organization itself may no longer exist in its original form, its practices continue through the persistence of discriminatory attitudes and actions in various facets of American society. The White Citizens Council's legacy also extends to how it contributed to the entrenchment of systemic racism and the perpetuation of inequality. Its influence on local and regional politics, as well as its advocacy for discriminatory policies, continues to be an age-old problem affecting communities and institutions, shaping social and political dynamics in the United States. These types of entities morph and transform, so even though the White Citizens Councils are no longer a formal and recognized organization, the actions and behaviors can still be seen through the individuals who have been shaped by their ideologies and continue to practice them. The dangers of unknowingly receiving services from professionals who hold white supremacist values are significant and pervasive. When individuals in positions of power and influence, such as doctors, lawyers, community leaders, pastors, judges, and politicians, subscribe to white supremacist ideologies, it will have detrimental effects on the people they are meant to serve, creating disparate impacts and maintaining dominance as they find new ways to control by deprivation. For example, a doctor who subscribes to white supremacist beliefs may not provide equitable care to black people, resulting in misdiagnosis, inadequate treatment, and ultimately poorer health outcomes for these individuals. Similarly, lawyers, judges, and politicians influenced by white supremacy may perpetuate systemic inequalities through discriminatory practices and policies, disproportionately affecting the black community. Community leaders and pastors who hold white supremacist values may perpetuate harmful narratives and intentionally fail to provide support and advocacy for the black community. When professionals in positions of authority and influence perpetuate white supremacist values, it perpetuates and upholds systemic oppression, discrimination, and exploitation, willfully undermining the well-being and rights of black people. Overall, the White Citizens Council left a legacy of opposition to the freedom, protections, and rights of black people, the preservation of white supremacy, and the propagation of discriminatory ideologies that continue to plague the white ethnostate of America. Recognizing and understanding this legacy is crucial in keeping yourself safe from the ongoing attacks through the racist machinery, with its system of laws, policies, codes, symbols, ciphers, and institutions. This beast is a familiar evil that sets out to steal, kill, and destroy without pause.
Oh, I wish I was in a land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away. look away, Dixieland. Dixieland, where I was born, early on one frosty morn. Look away, look away, look away.
Ku Klux Klansmen take over the little Georgia town of Stone Mountain. They direct traffic to their mass initiation meeting nearby, where the Klan adds fuel to a Southern revolt against civil rights legislation.
It is my request that this General Assembly adopt a resolution declaring the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States to be null, void, and of no effect. As long as I am your governor, there will be no breakdown in the pattern of segregation in this state. I am convinced that the purchase of Stone Mountain and adjacent property by the state and completion of the Confederate Memorial by a competent authority will be of everlasting benefit to present generations and to all future citizens of our state and the entire Southland.
And so, after 30 years of disappointment, the dream of completing the Stone Mountain Confederate Memorial is at long last about to come true.
How will this carving compare with Mount Rushmore?
Well, I don't think that Rushmore could compare any way whatsoever with this carving. This carving is the only one of its kind in the country. Nothing like this has been attempted in 5,000 years.
As I came in on the job, I must say that to me it was a challenge, something exciting. I thought it was nice to be paid for it at the same time, so to speak. But then after going into the carving, I began to read about and study about the Civil War, is our history. I had a sense of feeling that I was doing my part for these men. It's a very dedicating thing to read about the men and then go the next day and work on a statue. You feel like you're a part of history. Truly, this makes these men so great that you want to get right in there and live it with them, so to speak.
After nearly half a century of work, the memorial carving here at Stone Mountain is finally finished, and officials are calling it the 8th wonder of the world.
Mighty mountain, what have you seen? Pages of time turning evergreen. Dew-covered mornings, new days are born in Stone Mountain, a place where history lives.
A typical Stone Mountain day often begins in the simple but grand manner of the Old South. It's expressed in the soft words of a plantation hostess welcoming a visitor to restored Antebellum Manor House. "Mornin', welcome to Dickey House," are the words you would hear. Come in and share our home, where we live plantation history every day. And just down the path, the fire is crackling, and the cornbread is browning. In the plantation cookhouse, Lena Weaver turns the clock back to bygone ways. Her Old South cooking is the kind of history you can see, hear, smell, and taste. Remember how it used to be? It's still that way for you to enjoy at Stone Mountain Park. Millions now come from throughout the world. Today, more than ever, you are a place for all seasons, for all men, a place where history lives.